Good evening, everyone. We welcome you to this final episode, the final webinar in the series of Inaslresearch Methodology and Statistics Workshop. We welcome you to this final episode, the final webinar in the series, well taken by the audience. And today we have the theme on writing the scientific papers, and we have in faculty a number of people who have been editors and are currently editors of important journals. So the course directors you all know are Professor Thuluvar. He is the director, Institute of Digestive Health and Liver Diseases at Mercy Medical Center, and professor of medicine at University of Maryland School of Medicine, Baltimore. He's also the chairman of ASLD Asia Pacific Regional Advisory Committee. We also have Dr. Rakesh Agarwal. He is the director of JIPMER Pondicherry. He is the immediate past president of our society, that is INASL, and has remained the editor-in-chief of Indian Journal of Gastroenterology. We also have eminent gastroenterologists and hepatologists as our moderators. We have Dr. Dinesh Jyotimani, who's a senior transplant hepatologist at Mohammed Rela Institute at Chennai. We have Dr. Pramod Garg, who is the professor of gastroenterology and hepatology and associate dean of research at All India Institute of Medical Sciences. His main areas of interest are pancreatic diseases, and he has remained the associate editor of the journal Pancreatology. We have Dr. Philip Abraham. You all know him. He's a senior gastroenterologist and hepatologist at Hinduja Hospital, Mumbai. He's also the past president of Indian Society of Gastroenterology, and has held the post of editor-in-chief of Indian Journal of Gastroenterology in the past. So with that, without wasting much time, I'll invite Dr. Thuluvar. He has some messages for you, for the young gastroenterologist here. Dr. Thuluvar.
Good evening. Good evening to everyone in India. Good afternoon to those in England. And good morning to my colleagues and friends in USA. I suppose you may remember that this process started sometimes the beginning of this year when we were supposed to meet in New Delhi for an ASLD Connect program. The whole concept behind that was to have interaction between young physicians from India and make them connect to those who are in the US and other parts of the world. Hoping that we can foster their research, encourage them, help them, mentor them. So I think we should continue that process. I think many of my colleagues, I'm sure both in Europe, Australia, and USA, would like to help the young people. And they may find some time either in the early part when they plan for a study. If you are, for instance, if you are doing something on portal hypertension, Dr. Jalan would be perhaps happy to just look through the protocol and see it's worthwhile doing it, spending the time and resources, or how one could improve that. It might take a few minutes or a few hours of our time, but many of my colleagues have said they would be happy to do that. Or if you write a paper, whether you could get someone to review that. And I think we should continue to do that. And I hope you will reach out to the faculty or physicians from India as well as other parts of the world to improve your prospects in research and publication. On the same topic, I just want you to think about becoming members of ASLD as a trainee. And this is very subsidized, about $25 per year. You will have access to the journal Hepatology and Liver Transplant. I'm sure Dr. Jalan could say the same thing may have been with the ESL as well. And that $25 is worth spending because you will have access to all the journals. You could attend the meeting, ASLD meeting, free of cost. And there are many activities going on, both at ESL and ASLD. And we just started ESL Clinical Practice SIG, our first session, the a case format session. We are going to discuss about adenomas and FNH, how to manage a multidisciplinary approach. So it's a case-based discussion. This will be recorded and you can watch it anytime. And I think it may be worth considering that option. And some of my colleagues also have expressed an interest to help young faculty or students to get training grants to travel to USA or other institutions. National Institute of Health has a Fogarty International Center for non-communicable diseases. There are a number of ways you can get grants. You need to have a faculty member in US, and then you can collaborate with the major institution in India. And some of my friends said they will be able to work with you if you are interested. Next deadline is early November, maybe a bit too late for that this year, but we could work on it if you have an interest. And this may be something you can come for 3 to 6 months or for a specific program. And I think Kaushal want to talk about the INSL. INSL has a program where you may send a young person to a lab or for a specific research project for 6 to 12 weeks. INSL will pay for that. And this side of the world, we will find a suitable center that will fit in with their research needs or requirement. I think hopefully we will continue to work together with the INSL, and we could have more programs like this. And I enjoyed it. The only session I didn't attend was last one. I watched the recorded one. It was very good. And I'm hoping that today we'll have another very good session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thulwat. And before I hand it over to Dr. Dinesh, I just want to remind you that today is a very auspicious day. It is the Teachers' Day here. And what a way to, have this learning exercise on this auspicious day. And before we start, I want to pay my respects to all my teachers who've helped me and helped all of us to learn and achieve what we wanted to. So Dinesh, you can start now.
Thank you, Kaushal. I was talking to Kaushal. It's one of these unique meetings where we don't talk about the individual topics, but it's all about research. And this has never been done before, actually, in India. So hats off to INSL team. So first talk, I would like to invite Professor Piyush Sahni. He's Professor of GI Surgery in AIIMS, New Delhi, and he's a Chief Editor of the National Medical Journal of India. He's going to talk about writing a paper. Professor Piyush.
Thank you. So without much ado, I think we'd go ahead and talk about how to write a paper. So before we start writing, what we need to ask ourselves is, do I have anything worthwhile to say? I think a lot of us want to write for the sake of writing, and that's not a great idea. We must be sure that we have something worthwhile to say. If there is something worthwhile to say, then we need to look for the right format. Once we've done that, we need to get on to knowing what to do and how to do. But I think what's extremely important is, I'm often asked this question, what is a good paper? So what is good for me may not be good for you, because everybody has personal choices. And good is a very relative term. But to me, a good paper would have good content, a good structure. It would be complete in all its parts and would give me a message that I would be able to remember for a long period of time. The longer I remember the message, the better the paper. And the shorter the time I take to get that message, the better the paper. So a good paper, therefore, needs all these parts. Now, like any other thing, like anything that we write, We have an essay which we used to write in our school and our language classes. We had a beginning, we had an end, and we had a body in the center, a main body in the center. In school, we could get away with something useful in the beginning, something useful in the end, and a lot of rubbish in between. And hope the teacher was tired enough to read just the beginning and the end and not read the middle part. Unfortunately, you can't do that with a research paper. So the research paper is very similar to writing an essay in school in a language class. You've got an introduction, which is the beginning. You've got a discussion, which is the end. But it's the center of the paper, which is the heart of the paper. The methods and the results, something that makes or breaks the paper, something that allows you to get published or not be published. Now, each of these parts need to answer a question. And it was none other than Sir Austin Bradford Hill, who was a statistician at the Medical Research Council in the UK, but more importantly, did a lot of work on smoking and lung cancer, as well as causation of disease. And he said, when you write up a paper, you need to have answers coming from each of these parts. So you must answer, why did you start in the introduction? What did you do in the methods? What did you find in the results? And what does it all mean in the discussion section? And the acronym that we have here is IMRAD, and that's the IMRAD structure of a paper. So the content is determined by what kind of research we've done. And the structure is provided by the IMRAD format of the paper. Now let's look at each one of these sections and some of the things that go within the sections of this paper. So the introduction, we said, needs to answer the question, why did you start? So what you need to do is to remember that while you know everything about a paper, the person who's reading the paper is reading it for the first time. So you've got to make life very easy for that person by reviewing all that you know about it in a very brief manner. You just need to orient the reader to whatever you have done, define a gap in knowledge, and say why you wanted to address this. Be brief, be clear, and be to the point. Don't beat around the bush. We often beat around the bush because we're not sure what we want to write. So if a sentence does not help you answer the question, why did you start? Out it goes. It doesn't need to be there. And for doing all this, you need to provide people key references to support the information that you're giving them. So something that I'm very fond of, an introduction of a Nobel Prize winning paper. The Watson and Crick paper said these two lines as its introduction. We wish to suggest a structure for the salt of deoxyribose nucleic acid, DNA. This structure has novel features which are of considerable biological importance. If you look at the page spread, it's 2 pages. Well, it's actually not 2 pages. It's only a part of a page on each of those pages. So what we're looking at is a very brief introduction which tells us exactly what they wanted to convey to us. Nothing more, nothing less. So an effective introduction is something that talks to us very broadly, narrows down to present the issue at hand, and finally ends up with what you actually are expecting yourself to achieve, the objectives of the study. It's very useful sometimes to end your introduction by saying, we therefore decided to go ahead and do this using a randomized controlled trial as the study design. It allows the reader to focus on what you have done, what study design you've used, and you could even very briefly mention the participants in your study or the specific participants in your study. We then go on to the method section, and we said we need to answer, what did you do? Now remember, the method section is going to help another person do exactly what you've done. Until somebody else does exactly what you've done, Whatever you've done is not going to be accepted by people all over the world. What people are looking for is repetitive results of the same thing, of the same kind, before they start accepting that, okay, this could possibly be the truth. So what you need to tell people is what all was done, how was it done, when was it done? And now you'd say, how does that make a difference? It does make a difference at times. Did you do it in the morning? Did you do it in the evening? For example, if you were to measure, say, cortisol, for example, did you do it while a patient was fasting, or did you do it after the patient had exercised? Was it done in a resting state? So you do see the importance of it. And finally, who did it? So it could be a person who is trained and he did it, or it could be a person who is not trained and he did it. So depending upon who did it, we might be able to surmise whether we can believe in those results, whether we should take the results with a pinch of salt or with a gulp of salt. You also need to tell people how are the results analyzed. Your statistical tests that you use should be, decided a priori. That means before you start the study, certainly before you sit down to analyze your results. Today, you need to have ethical clearance to do any study which has human and or animal participants. And informed consent is a must. Remember, saying you have informed consent, and if someone were to turn around and ask you for those informed consent forms, and saying, well, I lost them because the study was done 2 years ago, is not acceptable. And editors are well within their rights, and certainly institutions are well within their rights to ask you to produce those consent forms at any point in time. The income tax authorities ask you to keep all data for 7 years. The International Committee of Medical Journal Editors suggests that you keep all data for a lifetime, but at least for 10 years, preferably for a lifetime. You need to provide people sufficient details of the methods that you've used so that they can reproduce what you've done. Because if they don't reproduce what you've done, then nobody else is going to believe what you did was true. So if you've used a new method, you need to provide enough details for them to be able to do it. Or if you've used a previously described method, you could just provide a reference, describe it in brief, but please don't cite an abstract or an obscure journal which I can't look up, can't find. And you expect me to reproduce your results. If you do any modifications to a standardized method of doing the study, then please describe those modifications in enough detail for a person to be able to understand them and repeat your results. So the crux in the method section is to tell people what you did in enough detail for them to be able to redo your work. The reporting guidelines that can help you provide information to people. And these reporting guidelines are available at the Equator Network site, which I'll show you at the end of the talk. These are some of the more commonly known and used statements that are available. But you have reporting guidelines for reporting a case report, as well as doing a meta-analysis. The most commonly used or well-known are the consort statement for randomized controlled trials. We then come to the results section, which needs to tell people what did you find. Now, during the course of a study which you've done over a period of 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 years, you would have gathered a lot of information. All of it doesn't necessarily help you answer the question that you started with. So your introduction said, why did you do the study? And there was obviously a question in mind which you needed to answer. And the results that are relevant to answer that question are those that need to be given priority when you provide people the answers. Before you actually sit down to write your results, please collate your data. Over a long period of time, and this is true for residents, they would gather information in various forms. On a piece of paper, take a picture of a case sheet, of a case record, of a lab report on their phones, store it somewhere at home, somewhere in their desk, somewhere in a locker. and then not be able to find them. So collate all your data before you sit down to write. And this is not true for residents alone. This is true for anybody who does research and is busy and does research. And most people who do research are very busy. Prepare your master tables. Doesn't matter whether you do it on a computer, whether you do it on a piece of paper, when you do it on a big chart, it doesn't matter. But always, always recheck the accuracy of whatever information you put into your master tables. It's very unlikely you will come back. Once you've got your summary statistics, it's very unlikely you will come back to check the information in your master tables. When you analyze your data, list all the findings that you have and identify the important ones. Not the exciting ones, the ones which are important to answer the question that you posed in the beginning. The results are usually written using three formats: text, tables, and figures, and we'll talk about a little bit about each of them. The results of all experiments could be reported in the order in which the experiments were done, and this would be true especially for some of the laboratory based studies, because the experiments would be done in a sequential manner. The first experiment led to an X result, and therefore the second experiment was planned, which led to a Y result. On the other hand, you could also use subsections similar to the method sections to write out your results. It makes life easy for the person who's read your method section to get the results in the same sequence. Please do not duplicate information in the text, in the tables, and in the figures. And please do provide the key statistical results that you obtain in the results section. Your results should not include any methods, and you say, that's obvious. I know that the results is the heading, and therefore I write only results. Look at your first drafts, and you will almost always find some methods in the results section and some results in the method section. But please don't let the first draft get to the editor of a journal. Please don't include data for which you don't have methods. Please don't interpret data in the results section. And you have a desperate urge to write a reference number at the end of a statement in the results section, that particular statement does not belong to the results section, but the results are your own and therefore cannot have a reference. The only exceptions are systematic reviews and meta-analyses, where the results do have references to. Use appropriate statistics, provide exact p-values. Don't give us a number which says 0.00 because I don't know what this means. Say something like less than 0.01. Do not use multiple tests. If you torture statistics enough, you'll get the results that you want. But that's not what you're out to do when you write up a good paper. And certainly use some statistical terms very carefully. Some of these terms have a very specific meaning within the context of science, while in the English language, they would be used a little more loosely and could therefore mean something different. Now let's look at a table. The table has parts, and each table must be complete in all its parts. So every table must be numbered, must have a heading. Every column must have a heading, and every row must have a row identifier. A stub provides a single word or phrase that identifies or qualifies the row identifiers. And finally, there's a footnote. The body of the text is made up of multiple cells, and these cells need to be filled up, all of them. You can't leave a cell blank, because if you leave a cell blank, I don't know what it means. I don't know whether you did not obtain data for it, you obtain data and you're hiding it from me, or the value there is 0. In written text, always prefer text over tables, but the choice of whether you take a table or a figure also is generally to prefer tables rather than figures. Use figures only if you wish to illustrate something. So using a bar, a histogram, or a pie chart, always ask yourself, should I convert this to a table? Would it be more useful? If you have a number of items, always try, if you have few items, then always try and describe it within the text in a sentence or two. But you have lots and lots of variables, much better to put them into a table because 2 pages may not be enough to describe all the data that you have. Let's look at figures, which are usually used for illustrative or comparative purposes. Now that's a figure. And when I show it at workshops where we have people sitting in front of us, I often ask people what they think this is. And the usual answers I get are, the most common one is a barium swallow. It doesn't look like a barium swallow if you look at it carefully, but that's the answer that I get most often. And occasionally I get an answer that is a nuclear scan of the thyroid gland. So this is how you can misinterpret a figure. This is actually an inferior vena cavogram. This picture was sent in with a paper without any marking on the illustration. And therefore, if we were to put this into the paper, then nobody would be able to understand what is happening unless we labeled it. We finally come to the discussion section of a paper, and the question that we are trying to answer is, what does it all mean? In fact, Sir Bradford Hill, a few years after he described those 4 questions, or he said those 4 questions need to be answered, he once at an editor's meeting said, maybe we should stop the original research paper at the results section and let the reader interpret or whatever, or make out whatever they wish to of the paper. But that's not how science today wants a paper written up. So you do need to write a discussion section of a paper. Again, a section that's more difficult to write than the methods and the results section. So if you were to break this discussion up into parts, it may be easier to say what you wanted to say and what is useful for others to understand from whatever you've written or done in the paper. You can say what was found, which is essentially a summary of your main findings without the actual numbers and the actual p-values. You could then make 1 or 2 and very, very rarely a third point, what can be said about your paper. You then go on to the limitation section and say what one cannot say. And finally, a paragraph of conclusions and recommendation, which is the final word, with a message, a take-home message for people to remember the paper by. For each limitation, one needs to say, what is the limitation? What are the consequences of the limitation? What did you do to control or address the limitation? And how do you interpret the data in view of the limitation? In the concluding paragraph, you must try and answer these 2 questions. So what and who cares? A gentleman by the name of Ed Huth, who was fondly called the Dean of Medical Editors, who used to edit the Annals of Internal Medicine, said at the end of having finished up the paper, read it up and say whether you answer these 2 questions. If you answer them with the data that you have, you don't use sweeping statements to draw conclusions which aren't based on your data, then you've done a good job. But certainly have a take-home message. It's something like a Bollywood movie. People remember a movie for a long time and it's a good movie. But you don't remember, or you sometimes walk out of a movie at the intermission because the movie is not good. So if there's a good take-home message, you remember it for a very, very long time. There are other parts of a paper, a title, an abstract, keywords, references, authors, and acknowledgements. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, just about a few of them. As far as authorship is concerned, it's public responsibility to defend the paper for both its data and its interpretation. The people who are ghost authors who write a paper but are not listed as authors, this is common with industry-sponsored paper. And you say, well, how does it matter? It matters because it provides incorrect credit to a person who has done nothing. And there is attribution to a name, and therefore a person who's actually not an expert becomes an expert. Similarly, you gift authorship to people who've done no work. You name them because you need to oblige them. Or sometimes you name them because you hope to have your paper accepted. Let's put Dr. Rakesh Agarwal and Dr. Philip Abraham's name on the paper. My paper is much more likely to be accepted. Again, incorrect credit. But also important, if there is a fraudulent paper, then nobody is willing to take responsibility. Everybody says somebody else wrote the paper, not me. But they're willing to take the credit by being gifted authorships. So use simple words, use short sentences, and use shorter paragraphs. None other than Einstein said, when you're out to describe the truth, leave the elegance to the tailor. Use language which is precise, with which you're familiar, concise, and provides a smooth and logical flow of your thoughts, because it'll be easy for the reader to understand what you've written. Scientific misconduct is something that's looked down upon, and that's something that you should not indulge in. Fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, and there are other practices too. And a good paper would not indulge in any one of these practices. Does it occur? Yes, it does occur at a number of places. It's been documented. It occurs in India. It's occurred at the Institute of Medical Sciences where I work. This is the site of the website, a snapshot of the website of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. They provide us guidance on writing up papers, recommendations for the conduct, reporting, editing, and publication of scholarly works in medical journals. But for those of us who are writing papers and don't want to focus on anything else, manuscript preparation is a section on this website which can help us prepare for submission and send our paper for submission. This is the website of the Equator Network. It gives us a lot of reporting guidelines. Consort right at the top, but a number of other guidelines for almost all types of study designs. And finally, if we do get into difficulties while writing up a paper, ethical issues, concerns, we could go to the Committee on Publication Ethics website, COPE, and try and see if their flow charts would help us get out of our problem. So in summary, writing needs to be precise, simple, and uniform. There's no shortcut to improving writing except to write, rewrite, and rewrite. To make errors in writing is human. And today, there is almost zero tolerance for scientific misconduct, even in a lot of institutions in India. Thank you very much.
With this, thank you very much, Professor Sahni, for this very basic, but I think very important talk. The next talk, I would like to my pleasure to invite Dr. Rajiv Jalan, who is a professor of hepatology at UCL Medical School, Institute of Liver and Digestive Health, London, UK. Rajiv actually is a household name in India. Everybody knows him, so I don't think we need to really introduce him. He has done seminal work in liver failure, particularly ACLF, and I think every day on the round we have his definitions, being recited by the residents. So over to you, Rajiv. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Pramod. Thank you, Paul and Kaushal, for this very kind invitation. And thank you, Inasal, for organizing this incredible seminar. In fact, I really enjoyed the talk of Dr. Sahni because it sort of builds the story back in my mind when I started writing papers about these really important messages that Dr. Sahni has brought to the table. I'll be reiterating some of them just to illustrate from an editor's perspective as to how this works. So I worked as an editor-in-chief of Journal of Hepatology, which I edited for 5 years. I finished at the end of last year. And what I'm going to do is to try and give you a little bit of insight into how we think behind the scenes, which might give you a sense for how you present what it is that you want to do and how you get your paper published in a high-impact journal, which I'm very proud to say that Journal of Hepatology now is the #1 in our field of GI and liver diseases. So this one we'll talk about is a little bit about what happens behind the scene. What are we concerned with as editors? We'll talk a little bit about what is the actual process of the review, and it might help you to think about how you're going to get through the very many hurdles that faces you in getting the paper into print. They will talk about what are we considering when we evaluate a paper for publication in the Journal of Hepatology, which obviously is a high impact journal. So just to give you a little bit of sort of sense for how that works. So the Journal of Hepatology, which I edited, is the scenario that I'm going to base all my experience from and give you pointers for. It is the official journal of EASL. It is published by Elsevier, so the journal belongs to the society, but the publisher is Elsevier. So Elsevier has no ownership of the content. All the content belongs to EASL. It calls for a new editorial team every 5 years, and candidates are chosen for the editor-in-chief position by EASL governing board. There's a long process of interviews, etc. And so it is a sort of an open process. What is really interesting is what happened to the Journal of Hepatology when I took it over. This is when I started. In the black here, we were at an impact factor of 10.4. And when I finished last year, in fact, the last journal impact factor was 20.5. And this is what's happened to hepatology in that same space. And I don't know why hepatology has not improved the way JHEP is, but I hope that describing to you how we thought might help you in getting your paper into one of these high impact journals. So we think we as editors are very focused on quality. The two metrics impact journal is, number one is it likely to have impact? And if it has impact, then I need to describe to you what that means. The second factor, which Professor Sani talked about a lot, is about reproducibility. We are obsessed with reproducibility. That is, when I look at a paper, if I think something is implausible, then I will not accept that paper, even though you might suggest that it might be. So plausibility. So you need to show me 3, 4, 5 levels of proof that what you're trying to say, if the observation is very important, is likely to be reproducible. And the final bit is, which again, Professor Sani touched on, is about the beauty of presentation. That is, it must appeal. And that's the third part that I'll come to during my talk. So what is impact factor? Impact factor is actually retrospective. So for example, you saw that the Journal of Hepatology had reached an impact factor of 20 points. What it essentially means is that it's calculated by the number of citations that the papers that publish in the journal in 2017 and 18 receive in 2019. So there are two factors here. So number one is the citations, how citable is your article. And the second thing is as to how many papers does the journal publish. And these two, and so you can imagine that if I publish in my journal 100 articles, and even though the citation may be 1,000, my impact factor is likely to be low. But if I reduce the number of public articles, and that's a main reason why high impact journals have to be selective. It is not only dependent, so you're competing all the time with what else will go into the journal, because it just cannot publish that many papers. It's very important to understand. And so you can see that, I started up here when we were accepting about 13% papers. And by the time we reached to 2018, we were accepting about 8.4% of the papers that were submitted to us. And we were getting up to 2,000 papers a year. And as you can see, these were my four co-editors. Thomas was handling hepatitis, Ramon was handling alcohol and fatty liver disease, and Jessica was handling basic science and cancer. And as you can see, each of us were accepting between 8 and 9% of the papers. So what we're looking for is uniformity across the different subject areas that we want to publish the papers in. So there is a sort of the editors talk to each other. The editor-in-chief, which was me in this case, was talking, and we were modulating what and how we accept things. So the journal has a policy and will determine what it will do with this. And this sort of talks to the idea that there is a high selection pressure which the journal has. And so therefore, it is your job as the author to publish in these papers to tick off all these important boxes. The second thing that I talked about was quality. So impact is not the only metric. What we're interested in is that each paper that we publish is cited more. So we are judged, we live and die by our peers. So if your peers think that your paper is useful, then it is likely to be important. So, and that is measured by this quality metric, which is a novel item that we developed in the journal. Here is the number of citations up here. Here are the number of papers. Here are, let's say, the different years. What you can see is that this is in 2018, I think, that there are more papers being cited at higher citations. For example, when I took over the journal, there were 20 papers receiving 20 or 25 citations, 30 citations here. But you can see here, there are nearly 20 papers receiving 60 citations, suggesting that the quality of the journal is starting to improve in this situation. So how do we review papers? And, it is a completely transparent effort, certainly within the Journal of Hepatology, how the papers flow. So as I said to you, we receive about 2,000 papers a year. And this is really important. What happens is the paper comes to the editor-in-chief or the co-editors who have suggested to you. And as you can see here, we reject between 40 and 50% of the papers when it lands on our desk. If it passes this point, it goes to an associate editor, and they reject another 15 or 20% of papers. So therefore, nearly 60% of papers never, ever, ever goes to peer review. If it passes this stage, then it goes to 2 to 3 reviewers. It's evaluated by the reviewers, and the reviewers send it back to the AE, who then send it back to the co-editor, after which it comes back to the editor-in-chief, which in this case was me, and then we decide what to do. So it's confidential comments. These are all confidential, but it's an open, it's a closed peer review system. And as you can see here, that we accept ultimately 8.2% of the papers, and 10% of the papers are rejected with the possibility to resubmit after a major revision. So therefore, if you receive a major revision, still about 20% papers will not make it to the final publication. And therefore, it behoves us to say that when we get to that point about resubmission, it is crossing the first hurdle, but we still have a bit to go. So it means that the editors like the paper, but they will not accept the paper until you answer all the questions that have been requested of you by the peer review system. So therefore, the interesting part is here again that, we ask the revised manuscripts come back to the associate editor, and then it follows the same path again. So therefore, you might revise a paper, but if you've not answered the question, you'll still receive a potential rejection unless you're focused on answering all the questions. So when you do receive a revision request, you need to read very carefully the reviewer's comments. You need to take into account the fact that the people that are reviewing your paper are the top people in the specialty, and they will look for accurate answers to the questions that have asked you. In most of the cases, if a reviewer has not understood a point, it is likely that it was not clearly explained in the manuscript. Because remember, the people that are reading the paper are experts in their field. If you have concern, if you have to answer all the concerns on specific questions, if you cannot provide additional experiments, you must justify very clearly why. And an example here is that, and again, there's a lot of criticism in the publication world about the power of the peer reviews, which again is being debated very highly, that as a reviewer, sometimes I'm looking for the paper to answer my question. And, so you are at liberty to ask, to tell the editor that, look, we think that this question is not appropriate for this particular paper for such and such reason. It'll take too long, it's a different question, and so on and so on and so forth. So you need to answer the questions, but if you can't answer a question, you must defend why it is that you can't answer it. Don't overlook it. So if a paper is rejected, we think that the rejection is because of some sort of bias or something happened. Oh, this is terrible. The editors are biased or what have you. So the first thing you need to do is to read the reviewers' comments, and you need to take into account that maybe they're saying something which is appropriate, because the second, sometimes we have this immediate response. We are angry, we work very hard on a paper, and we write a rebuttal. Rebuttal is okay in some situations that I'll describe to you. But remember that in my hands, so we had decided that, look, as editors, we might get things wrong. And so we were open to rebuttals. We opened ourselves to rebuttal. But even with very careful assessment, we were only able to accept papers on 2 to 3% of the time that we received rebuttals. If you receive thinking about a rebuttal, think about it for a few days. Do not be reactive, because immediately you're angry or you're upset, and it's only recommended if the reviewers are wrong and seem biased. But very importantly, you have to make sure that if you write a rebuttal, do not write insulting words to either the editors or the reviewers, because they will reject your paper without review at that point. So you have to remain nice to the editors and the reviewers and argue the point. So what are we really looking for when we are evaluating a paper for publication in the Journal of Hepatology? And I think Professor Sahani has picked on some points, some of these. So I'll come back to this again and again and again. So we have no way of knowing whether your results are going to be reproducible in the future or not. If the research is not original and new, we will not accept it. So it is about likelihood. And if you think about reproducibility, you have to demonstrate with multiple levels of proof that your results are likely to be reproducible, because that's all that an editor can assess. What's important, and again, Professor Sahni talked a little bit about this, that is, do the results provide insight into an important issue? Are the results innovative? And this is really important. If it has been done 5 times before, go to a lower impact journal, because you'll not publish in a high impact journal. Is it important? Is it novel? Is it a breakthrough? And this is what the Journal of Hepatology people are looking for. Do they provide insight into an important issue? You might be talking about 4 publications of papers, but is this something that is providing us something? So in terms of important issue, from a clinical point of view, the story is, are the results likely to change practice in some ways? And you need to highlight that. For basic research, you need to think about whether the results are likely to profoundly change our level of knowledge. Will they modify a framework? Will they modify a theory, or allow to develop new theory? Because remember that if it doesn't do either of these things, it will not have an impact that these journals are looking for. That is, if it's not innovative, it's not important, it's not novel, and it's not addressing an important issue, it will not move to the next step. And this is about reproducibility here, that are the study design and methods appropriate to support the results and the conclusion? So Sometimes we are jumping too far when we are interpreting what our results are saying. And you're concluding on something, you're making a result about something, but your methods were not robust enough in order to address that particular question, and therefore the results are unlikely to be correct. So it's a linkage between your aim, your method, the result, and its interpretation. Remember the 4 elements that get you to your final conclusion. So are the demonstration, the results, robust enough and reproducible? What about the study design? So what about ethics? We talked about it before. Is the clinical trial registered? Nowadays, you cannot publish if your trial is not registered. Experimental animal studies, you've got to make sure that you've got home office clearance or some sort of clearance to be able to do those animal experiments. What about disclosures? Declaration of interest. And this is, again, really, really important because the biggest issue here is about disclosure. The more you disclose, the less likely you're going to be caught out. If you have published a part of a paper before somewhere else, you have to disclose that you used a part of the data or all the data in another paper. If you're going to receive some money from some industry person, it is very easy to just write it down. And if you declare it, there is no issue beyond that because the reader then knows where you're coming from. And this is hidden all the time because you're on many papers with many different people, but without clarity about where the money for the studies came from. We talked about statistics. Where did the drugs come from? Who gave you the drugs? Where were they manufactured? What about cell lines? Where did you buy them from? So it is about reproducibility. That is, I know exactly what you've used, where you purchased it from, who paid for it, and what are you going to gain financially from writing that paper. So it's really, really important. So finally, all this thing comes down to reproducibility. Misconduct, we talked a little bit about this. I've got this in red only to say that if you do it once in your life or your institution does it once in your lifetime, you will lose, your institution will lose, and the journal will lose. So we are completely now looking out for it all the time. We are scrutinizing every paper that comes in for plagiarism, falsification, fabrication. But we'll go to 3 levels. And as Professor Sani said, so I've asked my colleagues to provide people that submit papers to us to provide us with informed consent. And it's interesting that there's one group that did not provide the informed consent. And we rejected the paper, but that paper was published in another high impact journal. You'll escape, you can escape, you'll escape a few times, but not always because people are looking out and you are marked. So the journals know each other and they write to each other about important people doing this sort of stuff. And this happens with important people. So plagiarism is copying. We use authenticate in every paper. So I have a report of 25 to 50, 60% similarity. Falsification is very common. Patients have never been entered into studies and 20 patients become 100 patients. Complete fabrication of data. And this is very, very, very common. In clinical research, it's difficult to detect because it's hidden, but the reputations are very importantly part of it. And this is my final part of the talk, which is a little bit fun, but I think this is really important. You've done work for 3, 4, 5 years. You've done a lot of work. You have to sell your paper. And this is what I take from neuromarketing. Neuromarketing is a commercial term, which is marketing that applies to neuropsychology of marketing research, studying the consumer's sensory, motor, cognitive, affective response to market stimulus. So you might think, what the hell is this guy going on about? But it maps on beautifully to a paper. So you need to appeal the journal in several domains. In the sensory motor, you got to make it nice. That is, the paper needs to be laid out properly. It's easy to read, so the reviewers like it. You got to make the cognitive function, you got to make it clear that people understand what it is that you're trying to say and how good it is. And you got effective, which is make it special, that the reviewer falls in love with what you're writing. And it is important to join these three elements if you want to get papers. And, Professor Sani gave you the instance of Watson and Crick, and that makes sense because it's beautifully written. It might be 5 lines, but you fall in love when you read it. So going back to this, the editors are our first clients. The paper lands on the editor's desk. The editor has less than 10 minutes to look at it. That's what they look at it. Presentation, design, clarity, effective communication. Justify, motivate, and impress. If you want to cross that hurdle, because remember that 60% of rejections are instant rejections. And we did an audit, and for instant rejections, an editor, a co-editor, a senior editor spends between 10 and 15 minutes before they reject a paper that enters into their desk. Okay, so remember that you have to pass that first step, convince in 2 to 3 minutes that the paper is good enough to merit a peer review. Once you go beyond that, that's when you get to the nitty-gritty, when the associate editor and the reviewers get into it. Well-presented figures, graphs, care for detail. It takes about 2 to 3 hours per paper that any kind of peer reviewer is reading. So if you remember 3 hours, you've done 3 years of work. So give it time. So remember sensory motor, cognitive, affective domains. Justify the study, sell your paper, sell the story, develop the story, and talk to send the paper to a couple of your colleagues to read. Avoid conflicts with competitors. So when you're writing the paper, avoid saying nasty things about other people. You have to tell the reader, the editor, that look, here are my weaknesses. So they can't come back to you. The thing that I reject the paper immediately without going to this next level, is that the references are wrong. If the references are wrong, then that means the research is wrong. It's a sloppy references means sloppy research. So at every single stage, you have to make sure that you reference whatever it is that you're doing right. A sloppy reference justify the study. You know what I mean? So it's really, really important that you need to get each of the elements tied in. So when you are, a lot of very good research is done, but we are not neuromarketing right. And if the paper is accepted, your neuromarketing skills, and you must imagine how tough it must be to get published, but we can publish even better than what most of us are doing at the moment. So in summary, therefore, I think, what I've suggested to you is novelty and the importance of your question, robustness of your conclusions, which is based upon multiple level of proofs. Ethics are a key. If you're using 1,000 animals to answer a question where you needed 100 animals, is a big, big waste, and people will pick you up on it. Give confidence, give confidence. So go for 1 level of proof, 2nd level of proof, 3rd level of proof, that your conclusions are likely to be correct. Beware of people around you that suggest that it is okay to make something up. If you don't have something, don't write it down. It'll destroy your career, it'll destroy your institution. It's clarity of demonstration. Take advice, collaborators, friends, mentors, and talk. And all these are really, really important before submission. So you have one chance at it. Think about all the domains that I've talked to you about today, but keep it simple and keep it beautiful. And I'll end with that. And thank you again, Kaushal and Paul and Inazel and Dinesh, Pramod, for this very kind invitation.
Thank you. I think we'll take up the questions later.
So thank you, Dr. Jalan. We'll now move on to the next talk. That's by Professor Uday Ghoshal, who will talk to us about the Indian perspective on publishing. Dr. Ghoshal, of course, is known to all of us. He's a fellow of the Rome Foundation, which he's put as #1 on his CV because that gives international exposure to an Indian viewpoint. More importantly, Dr. Uday Ghoshal has made his mark in the Indian publishing field in that he's been the editor-in-chief of the Indian Journal of Gastroenterology, and prior to that, the associate editor of the same journal. He's also the associate editor of the Journal of Neurogastroenterology and Motility and the associate editor of the Digestive Diseases, Nutrition and Probiotics section. He's been the president of the Indian Motility and Functional Diseases Association and a senior editor with the Journal of Digestive Endoscopy. I can keep going on and on about Uday, but Uday, I won't eat into your time. All I can say is that you can't find a more competent and appropriate person to speak on the Indian publishing scene today than Dr. Ghoshal. Over to you, Uday.
Thank you. Can you see my slides? So at the outset, I like to thank Dr. Kaushal Madan and INSL for giving me this opportunity. I've been asked to talk about problems in publishing from India. So what I did is I did a PubMed search today, keeping the two words there, gastroenterology and India in one place. I've done a Boolean search using and in between, gastroenterology and China, gastroenterology and USA. Why did I do that? Because I thought these are the three big countries in the world, and let us see what is happening in relation to publication in these three countries. I got 7,160 results in relation to gastroenterology in India. I got 26,872 results in relation to gastroenterology in China, and I got 47,996 results for gastroenterology in USA. And I tell you, obviously, it means something. There is a problem probably in publishing from India. That's why we are publishing less. But also I want you to recall the number of people that live in India obviously is much more than US and probably quite close to China. So in spite of volume of patient being more in India, we are publishing less. Now, if you want to go into details, I'll request you to read this paper that just became online, Biomedical Research in Developing Countries, Opportunities, Methods, and Challenges. But I will take certain aspect. I know some of these will be repetitive, but it will help us to recapitulate so that we can do better. As Dr. Sahani said, you learn by writing, and writing. Therefore, similarly, you learn by iteration, listening to the same point again and again. Let me tell you, here is a farmer. He does hard work. But what happens is he actually farms, grows a lot of potatoes, but ultimately the credit goes to McDonald because McDonald knows how to synthesize material out of it, how to package it, how to make it attractive. And this is a very provocative analogy. I know some of you may not like it, but this analogy actually reiterates in simple manner what Dr. Rajiv Jalan said. Now, this is a typical Indian clinic. You see, the doctor is sitting there, and you see the number of people who are waiting to see him. And maybe he can see 5 or 8 minutes per patient. In some places, it is much less. So one of the reasons why publication is less in countries such as India or even other countries which have similar situation is because you have less time. You have to start maybe at 9 a.m., see 100 patients in the whole day, and in the evening, you are tired. So this is a problem. Now, second thing is that, but there are some opportunities. You know, need and priorities drive development and progress. Once upon a time, if you look at India, this was the situation. People used to move from one place to other place in the bullock cart. Today, people move in plane. Now, at once upon a time, there will be an epidemic of cholera, and the whole of the villages or many of the villagers would be dead. So, in those days, people will not talk about publication, they will not talk about refining the result, doing the statistical analysis, they will talk about survival. But today, India has changed. We have now economic development. We have a very low technology gap with developed countries. We have a huge and unique clinical material. The level of skill is well known because of enormous volume. We know how Dr. Nageswar Reddy does endoscopy. Advantage of India over China or many other countries is we are reasonable in English. We have now desire for national and international recognition. Now, MCI and DNB Council made publication as an essential requirement for your promotion. And we are seeing motivation by societies such as ISG, such as INSL, and so on. So that means this is the right time. But what happens is still, why are you missing there? We are missing there probably because there is a lack of good training for right research question. Also, maybe we are a little lazy. We don't strike at right time because I say strike the iron when it is hot. So for example, I will give an example. This is a study we did, 252 patients of COVID-19. Now what happens is we looked at the GI symptoms. This is the first probably prospective study on this issue. I know when this manuscript was being prepared, there was another study that came from US which was prospective, but all the other data that we had earlier were from China, and these were largely retrospective. This study used a multivariate analysis in addition to univariate analysis, but still we missed the bus. We submitted to GATT and we got rejected. The reason is we are not in right time. Already there is enormous amount of literature showing GI symptom actually is not uncommon, and GI symptom is associated with more severe disease and fatal outcome. So what it may be that if we would have done this in a right time before the other people submitted the similar paper, maybe we would have got into another journal with a higher impact factor. We are now waiting this to be taken in clinical and translational gastroenterology. For this, you need timely execution of the study and timely analysis and writing. Many a time, because we have too much work to do, because of the exhaustion that we have, not that because we are lazy, actually you fail to catch the bus at the correct time. Second is funding is a problem. We all know that the amount of money or amount of our budget that is spent in healthcare, and further we know how much of it goes to the medical research. We also need good mentor, and you can count the number of people in gastroenterology who are into research, and therefore it is not easy to get a good mentor. Remember one more thing, this is very, very important. We must collaborate to make these studies nationally and internationally relevant. Like in Indian Journal of Gastroenterology, you get a lot of paper saying that spectrum of so-and-so disease from southern India or spectrum of so-and-so disease from northern India. So obviously, as Dr. Jalan was saying, that this paper is less likely to be cited because already you have paper on spectrum of this disease in India. Now to talk about northern India or eastern India does not really make it novel. We have to have good study design, including sample size calculation. Many of the paper that we get, there is no sample size calculation. Registration into the clinical trial registry has already been mentioned. One needs to have very good data analysis and interpretation. Writing style is very, very important. And maybe in our curriculum, we need to make this study designing, data analysis, and writing training more and more. Though a lot of societies are doing this now, Also, we know MCI has made this sort of courses mandatory even at the graduate level, but we have a long way to go. We have also a problem in English because English is not our native language. Therefore, we tend to make mistakes. Now, there, the important thing is that all the young people who wish to write, I request you to write all the English in active voice, short sentences, avoid combining sentences. Actually, this creates a lot of error in English. One other thing is stick to a few areas in your career, particularly in your research career. Because what happens is, because we have less number of specialists in India with a huge population, we cannot be super specialized like the way it happens in Western countries, where they have more specialists for a lesser number of people, and therefore they can specialize even in their practice. But in our case, we cannot specialize so much in practice that I would be doing only functional GI diseases and not do endoscopy or ERCP is not possible. But when it comes to research, always pick up one or two areas, because then you know the cutting edge issues on that area. The research question will be more novel because you know where the literature has ended and where you have to ask a new question. Also, many a time, people will consider you not only nationally, but internationally, that you are a key opinion leader on that field. But the moment they do a PubMed search with your name and they find he's also sometime publishing in liver, sometime in endoscopy, sometime in, let us say, functional GI, sometime in some other area, then you do not get that recognition. Choosing an appropriate journal is very, very important. And some people would say, is there a bias against publishing the Indian studies in high impact journal? Probably no. If there was something in the past, today I think it may be not there. Now, steps in scientific publication include conceptualization, where you need original thinking, you need knowledge and scholarship, funding. There I talked about that we have a limitation in funding. Execution, there you need team making and leadership, and we all know these are important areas that we all Indian has to work on. We need a good training in data analysis, composing ability, writing capability, and perseverance. As Dr. Jalan said, whoever is a researcher, he knows that he thinks that he has done a great research, he has written a great paper, but when he sends, he gets a rejection. But rejection should be accepted very easily, and we should be having perseverance. And then promotion and marketing is very, very important. And this was a very important area that Dr. Rajiv Jalan actually elaborated. And this is one of the way you become key opinion leader, not only nationally and internationally. These are impact factor. And Dr. Jalan already told you, hepatology was higher impact earlier. Now journal of hepatology has crossed it. Like I know, gastroenterology was one of the very high impact GI journal in the past, but last year, Nature Review Gastroenterology and Hepatology actually beat that journal, the Nature Review, for which I worked as one of the advisory member. It went from 18 to 29. Very, very big jump, almost 11. By 11, the impact factor jumped. Now, this was already said. Now, question is, I was sort of trying to say, could there be a bias from developing countries, from the tropical countries? But there, you know, the reviewers are usually blinded. That means reviewer do not know who is the author, and the authors don't know who is the reviewer. Now, question is, does the blinding really work? I tell you, it may not work. In fact, there are studies now to show that the blinding doesn't work so well, because when you read a paper, actually you can make out whose paper it is if particularly you work in one particular field. So that in one field, you know most of the people who actually are working in this field, and you can make out. Therefore, it is possible there could be a bias, but this is one which we cannot talk about. We have to cross the path like the way this gentleman has to cross in spite of so many people trying to stop him. They are the reviewer. Now, one more thing, don't get discouraged. If you get a rejection repeatedly by high impact journal, don't get discouraged. Because now, because of PubMed, because of the electronic search engine, wherever you publish, you actually go to the world. And for that, I've put this analogy. Let us say you have all the domestic airport, but the domestic airport not only flies the domestic planes, but also flies the international plane. So if you catch a domestic journal, even now, there are many now, Indian Journal of Gastroenterology, the impact factor is rising, Journal of Digestive Endoscopy, Clinical and Experimental Hepatology, Clinical and Experimental Hepatology, which is a very good journal of INSL. Actually, these are domestic journal, but your aeroplane or your paper or your information travels to an international path and is visible to everybody. Now, also, many of us don't aim too high. If you aim too low, then you don't reach where you want to reach. The greatest danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and we miss it, but that it is too low and we reach it. So therefore, try to reach the topmost journal like Dr. Rajiv Jalan was referring to, Journal of Hepatology. Novelty is important there. He said repeatedly reproducibility, and second thing is novelty. Second is English language and writing style is very, very important. Another issue that particularly I see among the young people, that they actually sometimes are not very careful whether there could be plagiarism. So one may think that how will somebody pick up with enormous amount of literature in the world, how will he pick up whether the sentence that I have written is similar to a sentence written by somebody else long ago? Nowadays, we have system, like even in our journal, Indian Journal of Gastroenterology, we have system. This is authenticate. The moment an article is submitted and comes to me, I know line by line what has been copied from which particular article and what is the percentage of copying. Therefore, write on your own. Don't try to copy from any other article. The design is very, very important. Like remember, case report, case series, this influence the journal impact factor negatively, because the case reports increases the number of paper that the journal publishes, but the case reports are rarely cited. Therefore, we stopped Indian Journal of Gastroenterology case report. I know this is discouraging to some of the young author, but we had to work to try to make our impact factor better, and it is rising. It is now close to 2. Now, what happens is the case report, case series, that is what you should not aim. You should aim either analytic epidemiology, not even descriptive epidemiology. You should aim randomized controlled trial, which are the most powerful study design or meta-analysis. Key to the success, I would say, are clarity. My previous speaker already said that. Clarity, brevity. So if you get a novel finding, state it bravely, don't hide. Avoid verbosity. English should be good, avoid joining sentences, short sentences in active voice. For us, easy way is divide into subsection. So everything you should write small subsection first, and within this subsection, fill in some of the text, small paragraph. A picture conveys more than 1,000 words. For example, look at this. This is one of our study that got published in American Journal of Gastroenterology, where we studied post-infection IBS, and there we wanted to study a group of people who had acute infective gastroenteritis, another group healthy control, and we looked for development of PI IBS, PI dyspepsia, and so on. So what happens is this picture not only talks about the method of the study, but also it outlines the result of the study. What is the advantage of this picture? One is, as Dr. Rajiv Jalan was saying, that he has very little time. In fact, all of us very little time to read so many papers that are submitted. So what you do is that at a glance, you can make out from the picture, is it worth sending for peer review? Now, what happens is when you do that, also remember journal gains positively, because if there is an article where there is a beautiful picture and there is another article where there is no picture, when somebody gives a lecture, he tends to copy the picture that is there in an article. And when he copies the picture, he knows about that article in a great length, and the next paper that he will be writing, probably he will tend to cite this paper. So therefore, journal will get a citation. But when you make this picture, never copy from any search engine, for example, Google, because most of these pictures are copyrighted. So I'll suggest ask your artist to draw it. And many institutions have such artists. But again, this is a problem in India. Everybody don't work in an institutional environment. So therefore, that will be a limitation. Also, this has already been said, PICO, look at the patient population problem, intervention, prognostic factor exposure, C for comparison of intervention, O for outcome. Also keep all the data, like the moment patients enter into screening, you keep their data, because otherwise people don't know, or editor doesn't know how many patients you screen and ultimately how many did you finally get. Because if you screen 1,000 patients and you recruited only 10 patients, I know this conclusion is not robust. It is not reproducible in a large population. It is a very skewed group of patients whom you recruited. Therefore, your conclusions may not be very valid, generalizable, and robust. Now, so therefore, these are the design issues that have problem in India. So fund is a major issue. Having good mentor is a major issue. Having time is a major issue. The analysis of the data is a major issue. Writing it in English language may be an issue. And also, maybe we have to change our attitude. We have to see that in spite of the huge number of patients that we see, we should be able to be better in the future. Like again, I reiterate this slide, gastroenterology in India, 7,000 publication, China and gastroenterology, 26,000 publication, and US gastroenterology, 47,000 population. Thank you so much. Have it 47,000 paper. Thank you so much.
That's a wonderful free talks from all these eminent people around the world. It's really useful, not only for the students, also people like us who are watching it. It's fantastic, actually. Can I just ask first question to Professor Sani? When we write a paper, do we choose the journal first and write according to the requirements, or you write first and then change it according to their journal requirements? How do we go about it, actually? And how to choose a journal for your paper?
So it could work either way. You could choose a journal and then go ahead and write the paper according to requirements of the journal. But for a beginner, I would suggest that you write a paper first and then go around choosing the journal. More experienced people could try and choose a journal because they would be able to assess the quality of their research much better, and therefore aim to fit their journal at a particular level. Generally, it's a good idea to aim a bit higher than where you would expect the journal to get published. So if you were to aim for Professor Jalan's journal and he were to reject your paper, he would give you a very decent set of comments on the basis of which he was rejecting your paper. You could look at those comments carefully and revise your paper. Unfortunately, a lot of us don't look at comments of reviewers to revise our papers. We say they're idiots. They don't know what they're talking about. I know exactly what I am doing. And you throw those comments into the dustbin. And you send the same rubbish that you'd written the first time around to the next set of people. That's unfortunate. There's some experts who spent a lot of time looking at your paper and telling you where the P's and Q's should be and should not be, where you should dot and cross the words. And if you don't look at that stuff, it's your loss. It's not their loss. It's not the journal's loss. We also have this inherent thing about, you know, the people in the West are biased against us. They don't like us. Unfortunately, that's not true. A lot of journals would bend over backwards to try and get Indian authors to publish or Chinese authors to publish in their journals. You know why? Because their marketing and sales team could sell their journals to a large audience. And they've been trying to do this for the last 30, 40 years. Unfortunately, we haven't reached that mark. We've always, been happy with mediocrity. So choosing a journal would work if you could assess the quality of your research and assess where your research paper would fit in. But if you can't make that assessment, just write a good paper and send it out to a journal where you don't expect a set of comments, and then see where you can find the right place for your paper.
Sure.
Hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. That's wonderful explanation on that, actually. Is there any other questions from the moderators?
Yeah, there are a few questions listed here from the delegates or the people who are listening in. But one of the broad themes that comes up, we've had 3 eminent speakers, all of them wonderful editors of good journals. So they're all looking at it from what the journal wants from an author. Look at it from the author's viewpoint, and you realize that the two are at loggerheads. There's a conflict of interest between the journal and the author. The author wants publication, and the journal increasingly seems to say, we don't want your publication. Right? So what is it that the journal is trying to sell? What is this thing about impact factor that the journal wants to sell? I can understand a website, for example, wanting more hits so they get more ads. But why does the journal want impact factor and become so restrictive that they want to virtually kill initiatives from an author, which is completely at loggerheads with what the author wants? So can these 3 editors enlighten and take a look at wearing the shoes from the other side? Why this so much drive for impact factor?
So maybe I'll start, if I may. I think that's an excellent question, because it sort of talks to a lot of discussion in the literature, which is in Nature and Science and in big journals that are starting to talk about the problems of impact factor generation. It is the reality is that we have created a system of what constitutes a paper which is supposedly the highest quality. And so it is a quality metric to be published in one of the high impact journals. There is a very clear description now that every piece of research that we do, however good or however bad it is, has to be published. It doesn't have to be published in the highest impact journal, but it needs to be out there in the public domain so that people don't make those mistakes again. The problem is about design, what it does, what it doesn't do. But your person asking the question is completely right, that every paper needs to be published. It doesn't have to be published in the top, so to say, highest impact journals, which are restricted. But you'll have many publication platforms, which is where it should be available for download. So open platform for publishing all research that's ever done is the only ethical way to proceed.
So if I may just come in, Rajiv, this is a very important point you make. And I happen to be fortunately, unfortunately, on one of the editorial boards of scientific reports. Mm-hmm. Now, Scientific Reports is a journal, and I'm sure all of you know that it publishes anything that you send it, regardless of the specialty or the subject. And what they say, what they tell to the editors is, don't look at the results or the impact it's likely to have or the novelty. Look at the methods. If you feel that the methods are okay to generate the results that they have, it is okay to accept it. And I think that's the important point. Now, at some point, I do feel that they really want to accept more and more because it's an open platform. They ask for money. They get, what, $2,000 or something for publication. In fact, what has happened, and I think maybe this is, I don't know whether I should say that or not. Sometimes even you get a letter whether it is right to reject this paper or not. And you have to say, no, I think it is important. So I think that the compromise between a journal like yours and a compromise between a journal like Scientific Reports is very important. Your thoughts on that?
So, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
And, sorry.
Please go ahead.
No, it's like, no, so I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. That is, we are obviously very restrictive. We are a society journal who is trying to be the best in the field, which is a sort of a metric, whether it's correct or wrong, we can think about it. Because we realize that we are so restrictive, we have now started a second journal, which is called JHEP Reports. Because we understood that, we are losing some fantastic science to be published by other people. But what we adhere to is a very rigorous peer review and a very open, transparent process of acceptance. The argument against a Scientific Reports publication is that paper, if it is available, if it is scientifically poor, will enter into the marketplace in the same way as a paper which has been done with a very, very great deal of integrity. So how do you draw a difference? I don't know, So it is about making sure that the methods, as you say, are correct. It is exploited correctly. The interpretation is correct, rather than contaminating, so to say, the literature just by putting it out there. So I don't think that there is a very clear answer to your question as to which model is right. And I think it is scientific rigor is important. Innovation is important for the very high impact journals. But as we have already said, that we have to find studies that are repeated in order to give gravity to the innovative science. If it is not repeated many times over, then there is no value to what somebody might have discovered in the previous paper. So, it is a balance. And I think that, as editors and as reviewers, we have to remain honest, that we can place the author, their work into perspective and their perspective to make sure that they're not saying something which they did not do. All the work that you do needs to see the light of day and be available. It has to be.
Yeah, see, I would like to add here what Dr. Philip asked is a very important question. But what happens is, like, authors are trying to publish what they have done, but the journal also wants to publish the best material rather than a material of poorer quality. So when you have to get the best material, you need to increase the reputation of your journal. And whatever may be the method, like now impact factor is the method, that may not be the best method. We know the limitation of the impact factor, but still we know if a journal's impact factor is good or reasonable, then you will get more and more submission from which you select the best, and this best will probably change the practice. No journal will want to publish material which doesn't change practice, is not a landmark publication in relation to science. So you're trying to catch that yardstick of impact factor, which itself has a limitation, but this is the method.
Rajiv, may I ask a question?
Of course.
There are two questions. One, when we change the impact factor, there is a tendency to publish more clinical trials, as you may see in New England Journal of Medicine, very high impact. If you look at the number of publications, most of them cited often are the clinical trials done by pharmaceutical companies. And there are two reasons for that. One, it increases impact, and also they can sell a number of those copies in a large bulk. So there are two reasons why that happens. And the second question, I think you could address both, perhaps, should we be blinding the authors and the institution to reduce the bias? Because you and I know that there is going to be a bias when you review papers. If it is, for instance, if you were...
Sorry, I've lost you.
If you were to, I was asking whether we should be blinding the authors and the institutions, because suppose you come from Massachusetts General Hospital or Harvard or Hopkins, it is more likely to be published by a less known institution. And the same thing applies to authorship. Somebody who is very well known is more likely to have a high acceptance rate than somebody who is starting at the beginning of their career. Could you address, I know that some of them are controversial, especially the first one, but I'm sure you'll be able to tell us more about this.
So I think it's extremely difficult. These are very, very, very difficult questions in terms of the influence of industry on public publishing. You know, I'm sure that you might speak to the New England Journal authors, and you might have seen the recent article by the authors from the Lancet talking about how much pressure there is for them to publish some of these COVID therapy papers ahead of time. And this is very relevant because the editor of the Lancet ahead of properly controlled data. And, you know, this is the reality of where we live. And, you know, it is difficult to get away from. But of course, the pressure on society journals are a lot less, because the society journals grow up with thinking about serving their community. Community is represented by clinicians and by basic scientists, etc. So fundamentally, I think that, you know, whether it's the Indian Journal of Gastroenterology or whether it is another journal which is linked with the society, it needs to serve that society's interest as much as it does. But then there are these other big journals, which are big money-making organizations, which again have their own life. So I think it's just it's a difficult one. The second one is about the conflict, which is again extremely, extremely difficult about whether I accept a paper from my institution, the way, and that job is for the editor to do. The editor-in-chief needs to distribute the papers in a way that it takes the conflict out. For example, as an editor-in-chief of JHEP, if a paper came to me from any of my close friends, I would make sure that the paper goes to a guest editor rather than to anybody that is in Europe that might influence that article. So, you know, I consider that the shape of a journal is determined by the editor and the senior editors of that team, rather than the peer reviewers, because the reviewers are there only to guide the editors. And, you know, whether it's good, bad, ugly, or indifferent needs to be taken by the editor and the senior team in terms of what the journal represents.
I think I can add there that what you said, yes, it is a very important question, but most of the good journal now follow a double-blinded policy. So reviewers don't know who is the author, and the authors don't know who is the reviewer. But what I was touching on, in spite of that policy where the first page is separate from the main manuscript, and in the main manuscript, actually, you don't have anything like acknowledgement by which you can identify the author. But still, people have done studies that if the field is narrow, for example, let us say you talk about functional GI disease, you talk about IBD, even from the writing style, from the earlier paper they write, we previously shown so and then there is a reference there. So from that, reviewer can make up. But also what happens is many a time what I found that even a reviewer or peer reviewer is known, still most of the time they are quite sort of sincere to the peer review process. And they are the one who has given me most difficult comment. Like two reviewers whom I did not know, in one of my paper it happened, they said accept as it is. And third reviewer disclosed to the editor that he is my friend, do you still want me to review? And the editor asked him to review. He even called me and said, I'm going to review your paper, but he gave really difficult comment. So that is what science is.
Professor Rakesh Agarwal is in the group. He's one of the directors of JIPMA. He's the main director of JIPMA. I've got a question for him, actually. So why don't we have this habit of paper reading, how to read a paper as an undergraduate trainee, as an MBBS student? Why it's not part of our curriculum?
So I think, different phases of training have different objectives. Possibly the undergraduate students that we have, I think they're a bit too early in life, at least majority of them. If we try to engage them, and there are some good ones who do engage in doing that, but I think for majority it would be difficult. And there is also, a curriculum can hold only as much because there is a limited time. But I think the good ones can be encouraged, and good ones of them do read some of the papers. Possibly what needs to be done is, I think we can think of doing as to make it an optional program. Maybe it can be something in the evening. Some good teachers could start a program once in a fortnight, once in a month, when they take up an article and do this, and encourage some students to join in. But I don't think the majority would be able to handle it as we are today. That's what I think. But I think even more importantly, the art of analyzing an article and critiquing an article among postgraduates also seems to be not at the level at which it used to be a few years ago. We need to revive this. And part of the reason why what I find is, when I became a faculty member, it was accepted that even the faculty would take turns to present a journal club and discuss an article. Increasingly, I have found that in most departments, the faculty has stopped presenting journal clubs. They are happy presenting a lecture, but not a journal club. And that's a negative thing. In my institution, I'm trying to encourage the faculty to present journal club and hoping that that will make a difference. I can possibly tell you in 2 or 3 years whether it made a difference. Thank you.
Because if you look at the students from the West, the MBBS students, it's part of their day-to-day activity. They do something. Professor Jalan can correct me if I'm wrong. Or Professor
Piyush has something to say.
I disagree with Dr. Philip Abraham. I don't think a journal is against an author. The journal wants to publish good stuff. If it gets trash, it will get rejected. You can then go to a journal which will charge you 4,000 rupees and publish the paper tomorrow. And in India, we're very happy to do that. So that's not something that's acceptable as far as I'm concerned. Impact factor doesn't drive me. It doesn't kill me. I don't have a sleepless night over an impact factor. The National Medical Journal of India for the past 30 years has aimed to inform, educate, and entertain. And if a journal doesn't do all three, then I'm sorry. If it looks at only impact factors, then the journal isn't serving the purpose it's meant to. But then the New England Journal of Medicine is happy to have an impact factor and nothing else, and that's fine. But they too publish perspectives, which are nice ones. You and I enjoy reading those. We like them. We look at commentaries in Lancet and we enjoy those. We may not understand the original articles, but we're happy to read those. So most good journals, even those with high impact factors, and it's not necessary. So the journal editors are driven by impact factors because they're competing amongst themselves. But there's no reason for authors to go running after impact factors. Absolutely no reason. They should look for a journal which is appropriate for their audience, the audience for their paper, and that's where they have got to go and publish. So if they want to publish in the New England Journal of Medicine a case report or a case series, it needs to be exceptional. It needs to be the first of its kind. If they come to the National Medical Journal of India, the first in India would do. So if you want the first in India to be published in the New England Journal of Medicine, won't work for you. So that's one. Double-blind, I'm sorry, it doesn't seem to work, at least if we look at the evidence. There are a number of randomized trials which have shown blinding doesn't work. It doesn't improve the quality of reviews. And these have been published across the board in a number of well-established journals, not necessarily very high-impact journals. So I'm not sure blinding is going to help us in any manner. Bias. Bias is there in life. I like you, you don't like me. If two people sit together, they don't get along, do they? We see it in our hospitals, we see it in our departments, we see it day in and day out. How do you expect to eliminate that in the field of publishing and science? Can't happen. Just can't happen. The very famous quote from none other than Aldous Huxley, where he says, if I want to get my paper published, I will need to ensure that it doesn't get into the hands of so-and-so because he will dump it. So, a person of the stature of Aldous Huxley, if he needs to write that and say that I will need to ensure this by influencing the editor to not send it to so-and-so peer reviewer, then obviously there's something wrong, but that's the best system we have. So to say, New England Journal of Medicine published a letter which said somebody analyzed the manuscripts that came into the NEJM, and they looked at manuscripts typed out on an electronic typewriter versus a manual typewriter. The acceptance rates of the electronic typewriter typed manuscripts was higher. Now you would automatically say, look, that's a bias. But maybe they were better funded and therefore they had the ability to buy an electronic typewriter. They were better funded because they were actually Mass General and therefore they got more funding. So there was a bias again there. So where are you going to eliminate these biases? We can sit, we don't succeed, so there's a bias. But that's the world. If you wish to succeed within this world, that's how you've got to go ahead. Bias or no bias.
Grapes are sour.
So Piyush,
no, I don't want to say grapes are sour because that would, but I think we've got to accept reality. The reality is that there is bias in life. Whether we like it or not, it happens the day you're born and it continues till the day you die. Somebody likes you, your professor likes you, he doesn't like the other person, you get the job, the other person doesn't get the job. What is the problem? We see it day in and day out.
So Piyush, I can recognize a good friend when I see one. You began by saying that I don't agree with Philip Abraham, and then you ended by saying I agree with him. You agree that editors chase impact factors. It's a mirage maybe for them, but they do chase that, and noble souls like you do not. But anyway, that's a race between the editors. We need to still address some of the questions raised here, and we have two people here who've been asking questions again and again. Dr. Prajna Anirvan, she brought up this thing about impact factor and how it goes against the interest of the researcher, which is what we were discussing all this time. We call them an elitist group because some of them even charge hefty amounts, which automatically discourages Indian authors. And Dr. Moinak Sen Sharma here raised the same point. It's beyond the reach of Indian researchers to publish in these expensive journals. One more example of an elitist club there. I have been on both sides, so it's not that I'm accusing or supporting something, but these questions are based on what we've received from the listeners. There are two more questions that came here from the listeners. One, Dr. Amit Goel has asked, we talk about plagiarism. What level of similarity in text would you accept as not plagiary? What will pass muster? And the second question is something that's faced by every junior researcher, where you have to do gift authorship to your seniors. How do you handle that situation? So the first one is about the plagiarism. What level do you accept as okay for the manuscript?
So maybe I can start. So in real life, there is a similarity of up to 15 to 20% in most of the papers that we get reports of. The area where we accept, so it's not about how much, it's about where is it. So if you're doing let's say a study where we're presenting a method which is similar across articles, a lot of them can be associated with a degree of self-plagiarism, okay? And self-plagiarism is as big a problem. Where it becomes really important is in the results and in the discussion section of the paper, because, so plagiarism is not only copying, it is copying what? And copying what to put where. So it's not quantity, it is also quality. I hope that answers the question. It is not about the extent, it is about what it is that you've copied.
So may I just ask you, so for example, you are describing a paper where you have a management issue of a particular disease. It's likely that you will only write how you have been managing, which you will obviously refer to a previous paper as well. So would that count as a self-plagiarism or no? When you are referring
the point is that, plagiarism will be picked up as groups of words that are going together, and that's how we get presented with the data. And if you're citing yourself or another person with groups of words that are similar, and it doesn't affect anything new or otherwise what you're trying to say, we would usually let it pass. If, however, there is any indication that has led to something, so your first level is how much? More than 20% means it comes to the editor to say, is it significant? So yes, copying, if there's any evidence, there's direct copy of texts, that will be counted as plagiarism, and it'll be you will be rejected at that point.
Obviously, you're excluding the ones that are in quotation marks.
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah. So there is a qualitative analysis in addition to a maybe 20% cutoff for similarity. And the second question was about gift authorship to seniors in the department, which I know is rampant in India. Does it happen elsewhere too? And how do you handle the situation? What role does the editor have? How do you help the young investigator?
So it's very, very difficult. In real life, it happens everywhere. This happens everywhere, that people are just simply riding on authorships. And, I think either Dr. Ghoshal or Dr. Sahani made the point that, the problem of gift authorship is fraud. So if you're attributing gift authorship to somebody and the results are wrong, they will be caught with the fraud too. And I think that, I think it's an impossible question to answer, because we all know it happens, but we all are not able to address it. And that's why we ask for a declaration of what did the authors do in our papers. And, it is interesting that, when we say that we write a paper, what we are agreeing is that we will not write any falsehood when we write in that paper. So even if you said that so-and-so read, reviewed, and critically assessed the paper, if that is incorrect, you're just lying. And, so fundamentally, you are committing a fraud. And you may get away with it, but that doesn't mean to say that it's a correct thing to do. So it depends upon how you play that card. That is, everything that you write from first word to the last word, the first thing I'm saying when I read the paper is that you've not lied to me. But if you're saying that so-and-so did some work which they did not do, then you're lying. And, it is like any other cheap theft or cheap stint that you made. So I think it'll get rooted out in time as these young people grow up, that they will not do what some of us do in our everyday life.
So can I just add one more point to what Professor Jalan said? Recently, we got a publication accepted in Journal of Hepatology. Thank you for that. And the author's contribution is exactly printed in the end of the paper. Who conceptualized, who did what, data curation, which I don't see in many other journals being. It's all transparent and open. Actually, I think that makes a huge difference. What the authors contributed, which I don't see in many journals. They just end up with conflict of interest. So yeah.
Who's standing next to me?
Piyush has mentioned here that the ICMJE doesn't offer guidelines on this, but I thought they do, right? And one of the most important requirements for authorship is intellectual contribution, meaning somebody who just collects data, however mechanical and laborious that is, doesn't get in unless there is an intellectual contribution. So is that again a selection bias, meaning you accept intellectual contribution but not labor?
So I think so. People who've collected data too could be authors. It's not that labor is not considered good enough to be an author. If you look at the ICMJ criteria, they've got 4 criteria for authorship, and pure data collection alone would not be enough. But if you've collected data, if you've provided inputs on the paper, and you fulfill the other criteria, the other 3 criteria, then you're fine as an author. I think the problem is with a lot of us not wanting to bell the cat. So when I was a student, nobody ever told me that there was something called gift authorship. Now that I know that there is gift authorship, I refuse gift authorship. If I think somebody, so I fight with people who put my name on a paper and don't show me the paper, and then send me the published paper. Or they send the paper out, they submit a paper with my name on it, and I get an email from the journal. And then they say, well, we showed you the paper 2.5 years ago. So what happened over 2.5 years? Well, we sent it to one journal and then we sat over it. And you didn't change anything. If you sent it again, why didn't you show it to me? So now their standard reply is, if we send it to you, you take too long. You sit over it for too long. Unfortunately, if I am putting my name on a paper, I want to read the paper. And if I have to read the paper, I need to have time to read the paper. So the best thing is don't put my name. That will be the best thing to do. So gifting authorship works both ways. While we say a lot of people in India, the student would put the header department's name on the paper because otherwise the header department won't be favorably inclined towards the student. There are residents who would put your name on the paper just for the sake of their expectation that you would be happy with your name on the paper, which is actually contrary to what I would want, and a lot of others would want. To keep cribbing about the fact that this happens and not do anything about it and continue to do it, you're as culpable as somebody else who's giving a bribe to the policeman and complaining about bribes being given. So we can continue to complain, but once we know that this is wrong, once we accept that this is wrong, then we'll need to stand up at some point in time. Otherwise, after these webinars, we can keep asking these questions and continue to do exactly what we wish to do.
We have a senior person here, Dr. Kaushal Madan himself, asking a question. When a journal asks for a list of suggested reviewers, do they stick to it? Are they obliged to?
No.
They're not.
No, they're not.
Not really.
No. So, in fact, they ask you whom you would not want your paper sent to.
More important.
And I know a lot of journals will honor that, but I also know of a journal who doesn't honor that. They actually send out the paper to the person whom you don't want it sent out to because they think that person would give them a good critique.
Dr. Amit Goel has saying...
increase the database of its reviewer by asking the author to name the reviewer they would want, So journal is trying to collect more data about the reviewer, because nowadays getting reviewer is not easy, because you are giving time to the paper. Obviously, many would feel that this is a thankless job. So journal has to have huge number of reviewer, so they are building the database, but most of the time they will not send to the same reviewer.
Three
Let me tell you
quarters
the
of
answer.
three quarters of the authors in India, at least papers that are submitted to us, the names of reviewers are those of their friends, their wives, their husbands, their children, etc., etc. You can make it out from the names.
Actually, it is also, I would say, it is unfair for the journal to ask for the reviewer, and it is compulsory. You know why? Because journal, as we know, is also an industry. They are trying to create a database. But also look at the other side. Those people who are beginner, their problem is they don't know many people who they can ask, provide their phone number, provide their email address, provide their institutional affiliation. So practically speaking, they will keep on giving somebody whom they know. Otherwise, you may have email address on the electronic database, but you will not have phone number. But the real situation is we are trying to make a database of the reviewer.
I think we've also diluted the original purpose. I think asking the author to suggest a reviewer would be very useful for highly specialized papers, where the editor may not be aware of other people who are in the same field. But now it's become like a compulsory thing. Everybody has to suggest reviewers. So we've diluted the original purpose. Talking about reviewers, Dr. Amit Goel has asked a question, which I'll just modify slightly, saying, you big publishing publishing houses charge such huge amounts, but you don't pay reviewers. Why is that so? Why is the reviewer expected to do things for free?
So look, this is also sort of, if I may just touch on the first point that you were discussing, we actually audited. So I was a previous editor of Liver International, where we had this policy. And we audited the acceptance rate of suggested reviewers accepting papers compared with sending papers to non-suggested reviewers, and the acceptance rate was twice as high. So when I became the editor-in-chief of JHEP, we removed that as a choice. So it is data-based, so therefore it's completely useless. As far as publication fees are concerned, I think, this is a racket. And I think this racket needs to be disturbed in a way because, open access should be a right of any publicly funded research. We fundamentally now believe that papers should be published free of charge, and there are a lot of discussions going on now talking about having all the articles free. So in my institution, we'll have a green publication or green open access for every paper that we publish from my university. We have to have it as an open access phenomenon. We will not pay the journal for gold open access. But you must also remember that publication costs money. To continue a publishing house, to handle papers, to pay the editors, the associate editors, and so on, costs money. So where is that money going to come from? And either there needs to be a system whereby there is, a grant-giving organization that gives grants to public publishing. The question should be how much payment. How much should they be paying? Should they be paying these thousands and thousands of pounds and rupees, or they should be paying what it is that the journals need to be paid? Peer review, I completely agree. As I showed you, takes 3 hours to do a peer review, a decent peer review, even by experienced people. And that money is not paid. And, so we rely on the goodwill of the peer reviewers, and I think this will change in the future. That is, peer reviewers will ask to be recognized for the job that they're doing. It's taking time out of what else you're doing in terms of real stuff. So, yeah, I think it's a great question. I don't think we have an answer.
It is a very important question. And as Dr. Rajiv Jalan said, even in many journals, let us look at Indian Journal of Gastroenterology. Neither editor is paid nor associated editor is paid. So it is fully free. Now, Dr. Philip has worked for the journal. He knows I work for the journal now. I know I give, and Dr. Philip also gave, maybe 3 to 4 hours a day. 3 to 4 hours a day. But what happens is still now the system has been going like this, that the journal belongs to the society and we are working to the society. So truly, I'm not working for Springer Nature, but I'm working for Indian Society of Gastroenterology. Springer Nature came up with a declaration form where they said that I cannot work as an associate editor with any other journal and I have to sign that. I said, who are you to ask this? Because you don't pay me, you don't employ me. I am selected by the society. I decline to sign on this. So this is the level where it is going. That means those companies are actually taking away everything and we are working for free, only for goodwill, thinking that we are working for the society. But unfortunately, this is what academicians do. This is what doctors do, not the other profession. Like look at all these film stars. They don't even speak a single word in the television without money, and it is a huge amount of money. Whereas here, we teach, we educate, we see extra, we work extra hour. All these we do for the goodwill. And I think the respect that is on is enough for us. But what Dr. Amit asked is a very pertinent question. We should introspect on this, we should discuss on this, and maybe in future things should change.
Kaushal, before we finish that last part of it, you've sent us a reminder. There's some people who feel very strongly about this, about gift authorship and how it discourages youngsters. I won't go through that in detail. There's just one more question I have here from Dr. Kole saying, does it matter whether the results are negative results? Is it more likely that you'd accept an article with positive results than negative results?
May have been true a few years ago. I don't think editors are biased against negative results today because of the fact that systematic reviews and meta-analyses are done. This has been a very real reason for editors to change. Though there have been systematic attempts by editors of good journals to get negative studies which have not been published out into the public domain. There was one initiative in the 80s, there was another in the 90s. Both were led by some of the top general medical journals. The ICMJ led one of these initiatives. The BMJ and the Lancet led another one of these initiatives. And so there has been an attempt to do that. And I think over a period of time, people don't look at negative studies negatively.
No, I can I just point out before Rajiv comes in? I think there is a bias about negative results for sure. And not saying in a negative way. Because, if you look at the top journals remain NEJM and Lancet, Gastroenterology, Gut, Journal of Hepatology and Hepatology. The number of submissions have gone up at least 50 times, if not 100 times. So journals have to choose. And I think one of the reasons for having a bias against, say, a submission from India will always be there, because the journals are choosy now. They have a lot to choose from. That's another point. And if you give me two studies, one which is showing clearly a positive result, I would tend to go for that because this is likely to change my practice. On the other hand, if you have a situation like HCQ for COVID, where it's a political, politically hot subject, a journal like Lancet will even publish it without going through the data, and then of course we know what happened. So there seems to be definitely some bias, and it may be a positive bias rather than negative bias. Rajiv, your thoughts on that?
No, so I agree that there is a deep sense of bias against negative trials, and therefore the young fellows are continuously pressurized to use tests to try and make the results positive. So we are making the society more, how do you say, bias, or more starting to cheat the system by, the best study to describe this. And again, you might recognize this in the liver field. is what's called the STOPA study. I don't know how much of you know that, but this is a study of steroids versus pentoxifylline. And this is a great study to debate if you have time, to look at the data published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Okay, so if you look at placebo, steroids, pentoxifylline, or steroids plus pentoxifylline in acute alcoholic hepatitis, primary endpoint is negative in terms of no difference in 28-day mortality with use of any of these drugs. 3-month mortality is the same. But in a post hoc analysis, they show that steroid is associated with improved survival at 28 days. In order to publish in the New England Journal of Medicine, that positive result is what is highlighted, rather than the very simple 1,200 randomized patients. It's a very high-profile study, but it's a negative study which has been painted in a positive light in order to get a big publication. So fundamentally, my worry is that we will change our interpretation of the data, or we will make a p-value from 0.06 to 0.05 in order to go from statistically insignificant to statistically significant in order to have that positive result. And it is really, really important to also, as we talk about impact factors, we're going to talk about p-values, which is completely ludicrous endpoints. It's 94% as opposed to 96% confidence in terms of your results, which describes statistically significant versus statistically insignificant result in terms of. So we have created this issue. Negative trials are going to be published in lower impact journals, which is a serious problem with our publication system, particularly in the high impact journals.
And there, what you are saying is right, that there is a tendency to publish positive trial, though we know attempt has been made to publish negative trial. Even there has been supplement issues of various journals saying negative trial. Please submit your negative trial. Even we know there is a journal called Journal of Negative Trial, but still the bias continues. And when you do a meta-analysis, you meta-analyze all those studies which are only positive, and you say the meta-analysis are strongest evidence. So this is called garbage in and garbage out. But only the positive side of this is now all the randomized controlled trials are registered. And if this is not registered, this will not be at all considered by any journal. So I can just look at how many trials were registered for this and how many got published. And I know actually what is the real fact. And that's why there is a tremendous sort of gap between what a physician or gastroenterologist in practice see and what journals or books say. Journals or books say all the positive thing. They say, let us say 80% will respond to penicillamine, Wilson's disease, and somebody starts his practice and he sees it doesn't happen really in practice. So this is the gap, but because of this registration of clinical trial, maybe time to come will be better.
Do you think PubMed acts as a great leveler? It doesn't matter what the impact factor is or a citation index of an article is, but it just gets listed in PubMed in any case. Should that be the final goal?
I think so. I think, I've started to say, so to give you an instance, Demon published a probiotic study which was positive in gastroenterology. I have a probiotic study which is completely negative, which I couldn't publish in 10 journals that I submitted to. It's just been published in Nutrients. The point is, at the end of the day, this is the reality of this life. We like positive things. And I think the editors will change, as was suggested by earlier. But the point is that we are not there yet. We like positive things, something that changes our practice. And, we are contaminating our youth by doing that. A positive result is, well done, boss. If a negative result is, you go and drink the rum rather than the champagne.
I think we should close the sessions. We had fantastic, phenomenal talks by all the three eminent people around the world. Actually, we should thank personally Dr. Uday Ghoshal, Professor Raju Jalan, and Professor Sani, and particularly INSL for his phenomenal job, Professor Rakesh Agarwal, and of course Kaushal. So the summary is for the people who are watching there, for the youngsters who are watching there, please start writing, please start reading, and then criticize the paper. Only then we'll get good ideas about how to improve from there. And then again, get help from the seniors and start publishing. I think that will take us to the different level rather than just reading. I think it's very important to understand that. Kaushal, any concluding remarks from INSL? It's been fantastic, actually.
Thank you. So may I request Dr. Rakesh Agarwal to give some concluding remarks before I propose the vote of thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Kaushal. On behalf of Professor Thuluvat and myself, I am extremely pleased the way this session went. All the three speakers were excellent, and so was the interaction that followed. So that brings us to the end of this 10-week webinar series, and we at INSL have been extrem28 pleased to have hosted this because it turned out to be much better than what we thought it would be. And that was primarily because of about 28 to 30 speakers that we had. They all made it very interesting. And above all, the audience response was excellent. We had a large number of people attending and asking very interesting questions. We hope it was useful to people, and the lectures are available online, and we hope to have them available for some time to come. I thank all the speakers over the 10 weeks, all the audience participants that have been on these sessions, the technical teams that have helped us do this, Dr. Kaushal, who actually did most of the hard work, and Dr. Thuluvat for helping us draft this program and for finding a lot of foreign speakers that spoke in these sessions. And I can say on both his behalf and on my part that we thoroughly enjoyed. It turned out to actually to be better than what we thought it would be when we started off. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, so in the end, I just need to thank Mylan, who were the educational partners for this particular webinar, Maisha, our event organizers, especially Shifali, Garima, and the IT partners, Digital Infomedia, and Dinesh. So thank you all. Thank you very much for making this a success. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.